Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. We continue our discussion on analysis concepts and principles. This lecture is the continuation of the previous lectures in this chapter, where we discussed different concepts related to requirement analysis, and we have also discussed different rules, regulations, or principles for the analyst to perform their task. Let's have a recap of the previous topics we had discussed so far. In this chapter, we first developed an understanding with the term requirements analysis. Before that, we introduced the concepts related to requirements, what actually is requirement, and how requirements need to be analyzed. So after introducing the topic, we then have a detailed understanding of the major areas in which we divide the requirements analysis phase. So these are the 5 main areas in which an analyst performs different set of activities. 5 different areas: problem recognition, evaluation and synthesis, modeling, specification, and the 5th one is review. Generally, a team of different analysts work on different areas, these 5 different areas. Not a single team or not even the single individual is assigned to perform any specific task. Then we discussed what are the methods that we can use to collect requirements or to gather requirements from the customer. So we developed or we used different methods for requirements elicitation process. The main task is to collect the requirements from the correct customer, the customer who has to deal with the developed software. So here, more concentration is generally made on the interview or the questioning answer session. Generally, an informal meeting or a question answer session, or generally we can also distribute questionnaires to customers in order to collect required demands from the customer. So different techniques have been discussed for collecting requirements, in which we need to first start the process by some informal meeting or by some collection of or the question answer sessions in order to collect the answers to some of the confusions which the analyst has in his mind. Then FAST technique was used, which is generally a team-oriented method to collect the requirements. Quality function deployment, in which the requirements of customer are categorized and the more focus is given to those requirements which are more valuable to the customer. And once requirements have been collected, then modeling has been done. Model is then prepared, in which the common technique is to draw the use cases. Use cases is actually the graphical representation of different functions of the system, the software solution that we are going to develop, and the people or the actors who would be interacting with those functions. Then we discussed different analysis principles. What are the rules, regulations that an analyst need to follow in order to perform requirements analysis task properly? So here we discussed 5 different analysis principles. The first one states that the information domain of the problem need to be properly represented and understood. So understanding is different thing, and then representation in sort of some model is another thing. So 2 points need to be covered as it states by the first principle. First, we have to understand what is information, the flow of information and the structure of information, the relationship about different components of the information. And then we need to draw that information in order to have a better understanding. So that model will then discuss or will then highlight further more principles. As the second principle says, the functions that the software is to perform need to be defined. So if you have properly represented or properly have developed the model of the system as being said in the first principle, so once you will have a model, that model will highlight the important or the main functions that the software will have to perform. The modeling or diagramming, drawing the diagram, is an iterative process, keep in mind. So you may not be able to have the exact diagram or the exact model in first go. The functions need to be drawn iteratively in order to have a detailed functional diagram. While the third function or the third principle was that the behavior of the software must be represented as well. So the model, along with representing the function, model also represents the behavior of the system. Behavior is actually the response of your system to some external events as well as to the internal events. So first principle, if you have properly followed the first principle, this will ease your work, and the 2 other principles will also be followed. The fourth principle then states the model that we have already drawn must depict the information, function and behavior in a partition manner. So the model should be drawn in hierarchical fashion, in which you can divide the diagram in vertical order that will highlight the problem in detail, and also in horizontal manner in which the partitioning of the problem will be highlighted. The last principle states the analysis process should move from the essential information which you have collected from the customer towards the implementation detail. The model, the diagram that you have drawn will help the designer to have a proper design of the system, and ultimately it will help the developer to implement the system in code. So these were the analysis principles that we had discussed in the previous lecture. In today's discussion, we are going to discuss the software requirements specification. It is a document, and what components are to be written in this document. This is the document where you can see the major areas when we were discussing the 5 major areas. So this specification is actually this SRS, which is written by the analyst and then is reviewed by both the analyst or the developers as well as the customer, and is then signed. Once the SRS is signed by both the parties, then there is no change in the requirements. So let's see what components form the software requirement specification document. So SRS is the software requirements specification, which is generally produced at the end of the analysis phase. The function and performance allocated to the software that is going to be developed as part of the system engineering are refined by properly establishing a complete information description, a detailed functional description, a representation of the system behavior, an indication of the performance and design constraints, appropriate validation criteria, and other information which is important to the user requirements. So this is actually a complete set of user requirements, customer requirements, along with the detailed description of the system that is going to be developed. Not only the functional description, the functions that are to be performed, they are placed in the SRS along with the behavior the system will show in response to different events, and the constraints that the system needs to follow. The constraints, for example, the requirements, hardware requirements, the software requirements, these are different constraints. For example, the RAM required for your system is a constraint, and some other constraints as well. So this is a detailed document and is written at the end of the software requirements analysis phase. SRS is divided in different segments. It is started with the first segment, which is introduction. What is introduction? Which is basically within SRS. Introduction of the software requirement specification mainly states the goals and objectives of software that we are going to develop. Generally, these goals and objectives are described within the context of the computer system as you are going to provide the software solution. So here you need to elaborate the purpose of developing the software. What was the problem? Why you need to develop the software solution? What goals and objectives you have defined for the software that it has to meet after it is developed. So introduction is mainly the software scope. So after writing a detailed introduction, the next segment of SRS is the information description. Information description mainly provides a detailed description of the problem that the software must solve. So here you have to elaborate the problem that your customer was facing, a detailed elaboration of the problem that you have observed either through observation by visiting customer environment or through formal, informal meetings or by questionnaires or question and answer sessions. So you need to write in detail all the information related to the problem customer is facing. Information content, flow, and structure are written in the information description. What information you have collected from the client, how the information is related with one another, the flow of information and the structure of information, which we have discussed already in the principle, need to be written in the information description section. Along with this, the hardware, software, and human interfaces are also described for the external system elements and internal software functions. You need to highlight what interfaces would be required to interact with the system. Either they are the hardware interfaces or the software interfaces, and how human would interact with the software. So the interaction or the interfaces must also be mentioned in this section. The third segment within SRS is the functional description section. The description of every function within the software that is going to be developed is required to solve the problem must be represented in the function description section. It is in shape of a processing narrative which must be provided, which you can call as algorithm. So algorithm or the pseudocode for every function needs to be provided in this section along with the design constraints which needs to be justified, the performance characteristics which must be provided by the system or different functions, and one or more diagrams needs to be provided in order to represent the functions graphically. In function description, you also need to draw the overall architecture or the overall structure of the software must also be provided in this section. The fourth segment is the behavioral description. This is important as you have to also highlight how the system would behave for this internal or external event. So this section of the software requirement specification mainly examines the operation of the software as a consequence of the external events and the internally generated events. So the external events are those events which are external to the software or the external to your computer. For example, the atmosphere or the user, the way user interacts with the system. So here, the operation of the software, the behavior of the software when user interacts or operates it needs to be written. This will be the external event, while internal events are maybe some sort of interrupts generated, other helping tools required, other helping software required by the system. So different internal interrupts, different internal events which are generally not visible to the user must be written, and the response of the software for those internal events must be highlighted in the behavioral description section. The fifth section is the validation criteria. Now, what is the validation criteria? The validation criteria is the most important and the most often neglected section of the software requirement specification. This is generally ignored by the analyst when he or she writes the SRS. How do we recognize a successful implementation? How you can recognize it? What classes of test needs to be conducted to validate the function, performance, and constraints? We neglect this section because completing it demands a thorough understanding of software requirements, something that we often do not have at this stage. Still, specification of validation criteria acts as an implicit review of all other requirements. It is essential that time and attention be given to this section. So here you need to properly provide how software will be implemented successfully. What criteria should be met before implementing the software successfully? How the software will perform properly? What criteria, what external or internal system requirements need to be met in order to make the software operational at all times? So different set of criteria need to be written in this case, and it is only written if you have done the requirements analysis task properly. This would require to highlight the tests which would need to understand that the requirements or the criteria have been properly met before implementing the software. Then the last two sections, the bibliography and appendix. These are the last two sections for the software requirement specification. Bibliography contains references to all the documents that are related to the software that is going to be developed. For example, if you have taken help from some sources, some books, some journals, some people, you have to mention them. So this includes other software engineering documentation, some technical references, some vendor literature, and if you have followed some standards. While the last segment, the appendix, contains information which supplements the specifications. For example, tabular data, if you have some data which need to be written in table form, so you can write them in appendix. Or detailed description of algorithms, if you have written algorithm in the function description, so you can have detailed description of those functions in the appendix section. The charts, graphs, or other material which need to be represented in the SRS can be written in this section. So this is the segment-wise divisioning of software requirement specification. Every segment is important. You need to mention proper details of the requirements and the software specification in detail in order to have a proper review of this document by the customer. Customer would understand what is going to be developed after reading this software requirement specification, and this document is then helpful to the designer to have a detailed design, to draw the detailed design of the software or the detailed architecture of the software that is going to be built. And it will be also helpful for the developer to code this required software in specific tool. Software requirement specification, you generally in your final year projects, you write proposals. So proposals are, your final year proposals are the short version of the software requirement specification. There you also need to discuss in brief all these segments. So it is the shorter version of your final year proposals, final year project proposals. That is all for now. In today's lecture, we have discussed software requirement specification. Here we come to the end of this chapter, analysis concepts and principles. In this chapter, we had a detailed discussion on what is requirement analysis and how this phase should be conducted. Generally, software engineer performs this activity, which we normally call as the analyst who performs this task. What are different segments, different areas a software requirement specification, software requirements analysis phase has been divided are discussed in detail, in which we have divided the analysis phase in 5 areas, which were problem recognition. First phase, you have to first answer all what's. Then evaluation and synthesis, in which then you have to analyze the problem and suggest some solutions. Solution can be one, solution can be more than one. Then you have to model, perform modeling or draw the model of your software that is going to be developed, and At the end, you have to write the software requirements specification document, which is then in the final phase, which is then reviewed by both the customer and the development team or the analyst. Then we discussed different requirements elicitation techniques, in which different techniques have been discussed in detail. For example, the most common technique is to have a formal or informal meeting with the customer. Generally, informal meeting is more suitable, considered more suitable, because here the customer will not feel any sort of burden on him while discussing the details of the problems. But when you perform informal meeting, it is generally done between two persons, the analyst and the customer. So here, more requirements or more understanding to the problem may not happen. So the suitable technique is then suggested as FAST, Facilitated Application Specification Technique, in which a team-oriented approach is developed, which is a more formal sort of meeting between the group of developers with the group of customers, in which more requirements are highlighted by a different set of customers and more understanding to the problem is being made by different people within the development group. Next technique was the quality function deployment, in which after having the requirements from the customer, we then need to prioritize the requirements in the order that is more valuable to the customer. So the requirements which are more valuable to the customer are those which must be included in the developed software, and those which are generally not explicitly stated, or they are not, or the customer is not thinking about them, can be omitted. Those sort of requirements are, those set of requirements are generally known as exciting requirements, which the developer generally add to attract the attention of the customer. In the last phase, we draw the use cases, which is actually a pictorial diagram of different functions, different major functions of the software and the people who would interact with those functions. Then we discussed analysis principles. What important factors should be kept in mind by the analyst while performing the requirements analysis task. 5 different principles have been discussed, that were: the information domain of the problem need to be represented in shape of a model, and that should be properly understood. So this model will then help in the second and third principle. The second principle states the function that the software need to perform must be defined. So the model will properly define all those functions along with their sub-functions. And the third principle states the behavior of the system needs to be also represented. So the model will also highlight the behavior of the system. The behavior is actually the response of the software for or against or in response to some external or internal events. So how your software would behave to those events. So this will be represented, or this will be highlighted if you have properly modeled the requirements. The fourth principle states the models need to be partitioned in hierarchical or layered fashion. That means we can divide the model easily in either vertical form or horizontal form. The vertical partitioning will help to deeply understand the problem, while horizontal partitioning will help to fragment the problem in small parts. The final principle states, the fifth principle, the analysis process should move from the essential information towards the implementation details. You have collected the information from the customer, linked them together in terms of their relationship, highlighted the information flow from where input is generated and where output is going. So all information have been collected. Now your analysis phase is ready to be materialized in a working software. So through requirements analysis phase, a detailed design of the software or the detailed architecture of the software is then developed, which is then easily converted to implementation. At the end of the chapter, we discussed the software requirement specification, which is actually a document. Software requirement specification, generally you can call it a proposal in short form, but software requirement specification is quite a detailed document which is written by the software analyst or software engineer that contains the details or every ingredient of customer requirement and the components, as well as the behavior of the software that is going to be built needs to be mentioned in that document in detail. So this document, SRS, is then reviewed by both the developers as well as the customer in order to make changes to it or to highlight errors in this document. So this document mainly helps in understanding the demands or the requirements of the customer. A customer also understands what he wants from the developer has been properly conveyed to the developer. That is all for now. This is the end of this chapter. We'll start with a new chapter in the coming lecture. I thank you all.
Thank you.